Royal Guard notices a veteran crying. What he did next was shocking. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine grounds of the palace, its golden rays glinting off the polished buttons of Private James Montgomery's ceremonial uniform. 6 hours into his duty, the 28-year-old Royal Guard stood as still as the stone pillars behind him, his muscles trained to maintain the perfect posture that had become second nature after years of service. The weight of his rifle, though considerable, felt like an extension of his own body. The June air was thick with humidity, and beads of sweat threatened to roll down his face beneath the towering bearskin cap. But Private Montgomery didn't flinch. He'd stood through worse: torrential rains, biting winter winds, and even the occasional bird that decided his shoulder made for a perfect perch. The life of a Queen's Guard demanded nothing less than absolute dedication. Today was particularly busy, with tourists flooding the plaza in greater numbers than usual. A cruise ship had docked at Southampton, bringing with it busloads of eager visitors from across the Atlantic. Their excited chatter filled the air, a constant buzz of different languages and accents mixing together like a symphony of human curiosity. "Look at him! He's like a statue!" a young boy exclaimed, tugging at his mother's sleeve while pointing directly at Montgomery. The guard's eyes remained fixed forward, though he could see the child's enthusiastic gestures in his peripheral vision. A group of teenagers to his left were attempting to capture the perfect selfie, contorting themselves into increasingly bizarre positions to fit both themselves and his stoic figure into their frames. The morning progressed like any other, with waves of tourists cycling through. Some tried the age-old game of attempting to make him smile or react, pulling faces, telling jokes, or making dramatic gestures. Montgomery had seen it all before, and his composure never wavered. His mind wandered occasionally to the evening ahead. His sister was visiting from Manchester, and they had plans for dinner at their favorite pub in Kensington. It was during one such moment of quiet reflection that something changed in the atmosphere around him. The usual jovial mood of the crowd shifted subtly, like a cloud passing over the sun. From his fixed position, Montgomery noticed movement in the corner of his eye, an elderly man making his way slowly through the crowd, using a worn wooden cane for support. There was something different about this visitor. Unlike the excited tourists around him, he moved with a heaviness that spoke of more than just physical burden. The man found a spot on a nearby bench, seemingly oblivious to the bustling activity around him. He wore a navy blazer adorned with military medals, not unusual for a veteran visiting the palace, but it was his demeanor that caught Montgomery's attention. The man's shoulders began to shake, barely noticeable at first. Then, with increasing intensity, until it was clear he was crying. Silent tears rolled down his weathered cheeks, dropping onto the medals that gleamed in the sunlight. A few tourists nearby noticed, their expressions shifting from curiosity to concern, but they maintained a respectful distance. Montgomery's training screamed at him to maintain his pose, to keep his eyes forward, to remain the embodiment of the unwavering discipline that the Queen's Guard represented. But something about this man's presence tugged at his consciousness, like a half-remembered dream trying to surface. The medals on the man's chest weren't just any medals. They were specific combinations that Montgomery had seen before, in old photographs tucked away in family albums. The veteran's face, lined with age and sorrow, bore features that seemed to echo through time. That distinctive scar above his right eyebrow, the set of his jaw, the way his hands gripped the cane, all of it sparked something in Montgomery's memory, something that made his heart rate quicken despite his outward stillness. Time seemed to slow down as Montgomery stood there, his mind racing behind his impassive expression. The crowd continued to mill about, taking photos and chattering, but for him, the world had narrowed to this one moment, this one man whose presence had somehow pierced through the armor of his duty. The elderly man lifted his head slightly, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. In that fraction of a second, Montgomery felt a jolt of recognition so powerful it nearly broke his stance. Those eyes, he had seen them before, in photographs, in memories, and most hauntingly, in the mirror every morning. They were the eyes that had looked down at him with pride as he took his first steps, the eyes that had disappeared from his life far too soon, leaving behind a void that no amount of time had fully filled. As the realization began to dawn on him, Montgomery faced the greatest test of his guard duty yet. For there, just meters away from his post, sat a man who couldn't possibly be who he appeared to be, yet somehow was. A man whose disappearance had torn his family apart 2 decades ago, whose absence had shaped Montgomery's entire life, including his decision to join the military. The crowd continued their tourist routines around them, unaware of the emotional storm brewing beneath the surface of this seemingly ordinary scene. But for Private James Montgomery, standing at attention outside Palace, this was the moment when duty and destiny were about to collide in the most unexpected way possible. The harder Montgomery tried to maintain his stoic expression, the more memories flooded his mind. Every detail of the elderly man's face triggered another recollection: the way his left eyebrow arched slightly higher than the right, the small cluster of freckles near his temple, the distinctive pattern of wrinkles around his eyes when he grimaced, all mirroring the features of the grandfather Montgomery had last seen 20 years ago, when he was just 8 years old. That fateful morning in 2004 remained etched in his memory. His grandfather, Colonel William Montgomery, had left for what was supposed to be a routine visit to his old military friend in Scotland. The family received a call 3 days later. His car had been found abandoned at a remote train station, with no sign of foul play. The investigation that followed yielded nothing but theories and dead ends. Some suggested he had suffered from post-traumatic stress and chosen to disappear. Others whispered about possible enemies from his military days. His grandmother, Sarah, refused to believe any of it, insisting that William would never voluntarily abandon his family. She passed away 5 years later, still believing he would return home one day. The mystery had shaped Montgomery's entire childhood. He grew up surrounded by his grandfather's medals, photographs, and war stories shared by other veterans who visited. These memories had inspired him to join the military, following in the footsteps of a man who had become more legend than reality in his mind. Now, standing at his post, Montgomery's training battled with his instincts. The Royal Guard protocol was absolute: no movement, no interaction, no breaking of stance regardless of circumstances. Yet his eyes kept being drawn to the elderly man's blazer pocket, where something familiar peeked out, the corner of what appeared to be a worn leather wallet. Montgomery's heart nearly stopped. He remembered that wallet. It had a distinctive scratch on the corner from when his grandfather's service dog, Max, had playfully tried to steal it. More importantly, he remembered what was inside it: a photograph of himself as a child, sitting on his grandfather's shoulders at the London Zoo, both of them pulling silly faces at the camera. The veteran shifted on the bench, and as he did, a beam of sunlight caught something that made Montgomery's blood run cold. Around the man's neck, partially hidden by his collar, hung a silver chain with what appeared to be a peculiar pendant, a small, hand-carved wooden eagle. Montgomery knew every detail of that pendant because he had carved it himself in his grandfather's workshop, a week before the disappearance. It had been his first attempt at woodcarving, and despite its crude craftsmanship, his grandfather had proudly worn it every day. The implications were staggering. These weren't just coincidental similarities. They were intimate details that no stranger could have possibly replicated. Yet the logical part of Montgomery's mind struggled to accept what his heart already knew. His grandfather would be in his mid-80s now, and this man appeared to be exactly that age. The timeline fit perfectly. But if this was truly Colonel William Montgomery, where had he been for the past 2 decades? Why had he never reached out? Why choose this moment, this place for his appearance? The questions multiplied in Montgomery's mind like echoes in an empty hall. As if sensing the turmoil behind the guard's rigid stance, the elderly man reached into his blazer pocket and slowly withdrew the wallet. With trembling hands, he opened it and removed something, the exact photograph Montgomery had been thinking of moments ago. The veteran stared at it for a long moment, his tears falling silently onto the faded image. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, but clear enough to reach Montgomery's ears, he spoke. "Little Eagle." The cosmic improbability of this moment struck Montgomery like a physical force. Little Eagle, The child the nickname his grandfather had given him after watching young James spend an entire summer trying to spot the eagles that nested near their country home. It was a name known only within their family, a private term of endearment that had died with his grandfather's disappearance. The weight of this recognition, this defiance of logic and probability, pressed against his professional resolve like a tide against a weakening dam. His training told him to remain still, to maintain the unwavering dignity of his post. But for the first time in his service as a royal guard, Montgomery felt the foundations of his discipline beginning to crack. Time seemed to crystallize into a single, pristine moment. The summer breeze carried the faint chimes of Big Ben in the distance, marking the hour with its solemn tones. Montgomery's fellow guards remained perfectly still at their posts, unaware of the internal battle raging within their comrade's mind. A group of Japanese tourists had gathered nearby, their cameras clicking rapidly as they captured the iconic scene. A tour guide was explaining in hushed tones the strict protocols that governed the Queen's Guard, how they were forbidden to move, speak, or break character under any circumstances. "These guards," she said, "are the living embodiment of British military discipline. Nothing can make them break their stance." The irony of her words wasn't lost on Montgomery. In his 6 years of service, he had maintained his composure through every conceivable distraction, from fainting tourists to aggressive pigeons, from sudden downpours to celebrity appearances. His superiors had often praised his exceptional discipline, noting that he possessed a natural talent for the stoic demeanor required of a royal guard. But now, watching his grandfather clutch that photograph, something shifted deep within Montgomery's soul. The elderly man's shoulders shook with silent sobs, each tear carrying the weight of 20 lost years. The child the nickname, Little Eagle, echoed in Montgomery's ears like a bell tolling for all the moments they had missed. Graduations, birthdays, his commissioning ceremony, his grandmother's funeral. Without conscious thought, Montgomery's right foot moved forward exactly one step. The reaction was immediate. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by a silence so profound it seemed to swallow all other sounds. Tourists froze mid-photograph, their cameras suspended in air. The tour guide stopped mid-sentence, her mouth hanging open in shock. Even the pigeons seemed to pause their eternal scavenging to witness this unprecedented moment. Montgomery's fellow guard, stationed 20 meters away, tensed visibly, though he maintained his own position. In their months of serving together, they had developed a silent language of mutual support and understanding. Now, through the corner of his eye, Montgomery could sense his colleague's mixture of concern and confusion. The elderly man looked up at the sound of the gasps, his tear-stained face registering surprise at the guard's movement. Their eyes met fully for the first time, and in that moment, the carefully maintained facade of military discipline cracked further. Montgomery's rifle shifted slightly in his grip, another subtle but distinct breach of protocol that drew audible murmurs from the crowd. Then, in a voice cracked with emotion but carrying the unmistakable authority of a military officer, the elderly man spoke words that only his grandson would understand. Operation Nightingale, December 1985. It was the code name of a classified mission his grandfather had led, one that had earned him the Distinguished Service Order, though the details remained secret. It was a story shared only within the family, a piece of history passed down from grandfather to grandson during quiet evenings by the fireplace. Montgomery's mind raced. This was beyond coincidence, beyond any possible explanation except the truth that stood before him. His grandfather was alive, mere steps away, reaching out across a 20-year void. The weight of this reality pressed against his chest like a physical force. A light drizzle began to fall, adding to the surreal atmosphere of the moment. Droplets gathered on Montgomery's bearskin cap and ran down his face like tears he couldn't shed. The crowd had grown larger now, drawn by the unusual scene unfolding before them. Phones were raised, recording every second, though their owners seemed to instinctively understand they were witnessing something profound rather than merely entertaining. Breaking protocol for a third time, Montgomery turned his head slightly, just enough to look directly at his grandfather. The movement was subtle but deliberate, like the first crack in a dam before it breaks. The crowd collectively held its breath, sensing that they were witnessing something historic, something that transcended the usual tourist spectacle. The elderly man rose shakily to his feet, supported by his cane, his eyes never leaving Montgomery's face. He took a halting step forward, then another, closing the distance between them with agonizing slowness. Each step seemed to carry the weight of the 20 years that separated them. Through the gathering crowd, a palace official had noticed the commotion and was making his way toward them with purposeful strides. In the guard box nearby, the sergeant on duty had also become aware that something unprecedented was occurring at post number 4. Montgomery knew he had mere seconds before the situation would be officially addressed. In those fleeting moments, he faced the most significant decision of his military career: maintain his stance as hundreds of years of tradition and training demanded, or acknowledge the miracle that stood before him. In that crucial moment, Montgomery made his choice. With deliberate precision, he lowered his rifle to a ceremonial rest position, a gesture traditionally reserved for moments of highest military honor. The action sent ripples of astonishment through the growing crowd, but Montgomery no longer cared about protocol. 20 years of questions were about to be answered. Colonel William Montgomery stood before his grandson, his military bearing returning despite his age. "James," he said, his voice stronger now, "I never thought I'd see you wearing this uniform." His eyes filled with pride as they took in every detail of his grandson's Royal Guard regalia. "You look so much like your father." The approaching palace official slowed his pace, seeming to sense the gravity of the situation. The sergeant from the guard box had also paused, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of concern and curiosity. Neither had ever encountered a situation quite like this in their years of service. "December 12, 2004. The elder Montgomery began, his voice carrying the weight of decades of untold stories. "I was approached by MI6. They had uncovered a plot involving former Soviet operatives, men I'd encountered during my service. These individuals had obtained sensitive information that threatened not just national security, but the safety of our entire family." James remained at his modified attention, every word sinking deep into his consciousness. The crowd had fallen completely silent, though most couldn't hear the quiet exchange between grandfather and grandson. "They gave me a choice," Colonel Montgomery continued, his grip tightening on his cane. "Disappear completely, enter a specialized witness protection program, or risk the lives of everyone I loved. Your grandmother, your father, you..." His voice cracked. "I had 12 hours to vanish without a trace. No goodbyes, no explanations. Just disappear." The revelation hit James like a physical blow. All these years, they had imagined countless scenarios: amnesia, kidnapping, even voluntary abandonment. But this was something none of them could have guessed. "I was relocated to a remote village in New Zealand," the colonel explained, "under a completely new identity. Michael Sterling, retired accountant from Leeds. I wasn't allowed any contact with my past life until the threat was neutralized. Years turned into decades, but the danger persisted." A tear rolled down James's cheek, invisible to all but his grandfather. The older man reached out, his hand hovering inches from his grandson's shoulder, respecting the protocol that still bound them both. 3 months ago, they finally caught the last of them. A raid in Montenegro. The threat was over, but finding my way back, learning what had happened in my absence. The colonel's voice faltered. "I discovered Sarah was gone. My beautiful Sarah, waiting for me until the end. I missed her funeral, James. I missed everything." The pain in his grandfather's voice mirrored the ache that had lived in James's heart since that December morning 20 years ago. But mixed with the pain was understanding, and a profound sense of relief. His grandfather hadn't abandoned them. He had protected them in the only way he could. "I've spent the last 3 months trying to find the courage to face you all," Colonel Montgomery continued. "I followed your career from afar, through whatever information I could safely obtain. When I learned you were posted here," he gestured to the palace grounds, "I had to see you, even if I couldn't speak to you. I just needed to know you were all right." The palace official had finally reached them, but instead of immediately intervening, he stood at a respectful distance, perhaps recognizing that he was witnessing something extraordinary. The sergeant, too, maintained his position, though his posture suggested he was ready to step in if necessary. "Your grandmother never lost faith," James said softly, breaking his silence for the first time, his voice barely a whisper. "She told us all, right until the end, that you would have never left without a reason. That someday we would understand." Colonel Montgomery's composure finally broke completely. "My Sarah," he whispered. "She always knew me better than I knew myself." He straightened his shoulders, pulling himself to his full height despite his years. "I know I've missed too much, caused too much pain. But if you'll let me, I'd like to be part of your life again. To meet your sister's children, to share what time I have left with my family." The moment hung between them, fragile as spun glass. 2 decades of absence, of unanswered questions and unspoken words, condensed into this single point in time. Above them, the Union Jack fluttered in the breeze, a silent witness to this unprecedented reunion on its hallowed grounds. The crowd had grown to hundreds now, forming a respectful semicircle around grandfather and grandson. Phones were lowered, conversations hushed, as people sensed they were witnessing something far more meaningful than a typical tourist attraction. The usual bustling atmosphere of the palace grounds had transformed into something almost sacred. A young girl in the front row tugged at her father's sleeve. "Daddy," she whispered loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "Why is everyone crying?" Indeed, tears were flowing freely among the spectators, their hearts touched by the palpable emotion before them. The palace official, who had been watching the scene unfold, finally stepped forward. But instead of the reprimand everyone expected, he pressed a hand to his earpiece, listening intently. After a moment, he cleared his throat and addressed Private Montgomery. "Her Majesty's office has been made aware of the situation," he announced quietly. "Given the exceptional circumstances, you are granted a brief relief from your post." This unprecedented announcement sent a ripple of murmurs through the crowd. In the long history of the Queen's Guard, such a break in protocol was virtually unheard of. The official then turned to Colonel Montgomery, recognition dawning in his eyes. "Colonel, sir," he said with newfound respect, "your service record has been verified. The palace would be honored to provide a private room for you and your grandson." The other guards maintained their posts, but their rigid stances seemed to soften almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging the profound humanity of the moment. The sergeant from the guard box had already dispatched a replacement guard, who was now approaching with measured steps. Before leaving his post, Private Montgomery did something that would be remembered and recounted for years to come. With precise, deliberate movements, he removed his bearskin cap, the ultimate symbol of the Queen's Guard, and held it against his chest in a gesture of deep respect. The action, while technically breaking protocol, carried such dignity and meaning that no one could fault it. An elderly woman in the crowd, herself a military widow, began to applaud softly. The sound spread like ripples in a pond, building into a wave of gentle applause that spoke not of entertainment, but of shared humanity and understanding. Parents lifted children onto their shoulders, wanting them to witness this moment of living history. As James prepared to step away from his post for the first time in his duty, his grandfather straightened his blazer, military habits ingrained despite the years. The medals on his chest caught the sunlight, each one telling a story of service, sacrifice, and now, of love that transcended time and duty. A journalist who happened to be present was scribbling furiously in her notebook, understanding that she was documenting a moment that would resonate far beyond the palace gates. Her photographer captured the scene with quiet reverence, the young guard in his ceremonial uniform, the decorated veteran with tears in his eyes, the moved crowd, and the majestic palace bearing witness to it all. 2 palace staff members emerged from a side entrance, ready to escort the Montgomerys to a private area. As they prepared to leave, Colonel Montgomery turned to address the crowd, his military bearing evident despite his age and emotion. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed gathering. "Thank you for sharing this moment with us. For understanding that sometimes, love and duty can coexist." The words struck a chord with everyone present. Tourists from different countries, speaking different languages, found themselves united in this unexpected display of family reunion and military honor. Parents hugged their children tighter, elderly couples clasped hands, and young soldiers in the crowd stood a little straighter. A group of veterans who had been touring the palace stepped forward, forming an impromptu honor guard as James and his grandfather prepared to walk away. They stood at attention, offering silent salutes to both the young guard and the elderly colonel, a bridge between generations of service and sacrifice. The palace staff led them toward a side entrance, away from the public eye. As they walked, grandfather and grandson finally side by side, decades of separation began to melt away. James supported his grandfather's arm, no longer the small boy who had carved a wooden eagle pendant, but a man who had followed in the footsteps of duty and honor. Behind them, the replacement guard took up his position with practiced precision, but the atmosphere around the palace had changed. Something profound had transpired here, something that would be remembered long after the tourists had returned home and the day's photographs had been shared across the world. The crowd lingered, reluctant to disperse, as if hoping to hold on to this moment of pure human connection for just a little longer. Parents could be heard explaining to their children about duty, love, and the sometimes difficult choices that life presents. Veterans in the crowd shared knowing looks, understanding the weight of service and sacrifice that had led to this moment. By nightfall, the video of the Royal Guard's reunion with his grandfather had spread across social media platforms like wildfire. #RoyalGuardReunion began trending worldwide, with millions sharing the touching footage captured by tourists. Major news networks picked up the story, their headlines capturing the essence of the moment. Duty meets love, Royal Guard's extraordinary reunion at Buckingham Palace. The story resonated deeply with people across the globe. Military families shared their own stories of separation and reunion, creating a ripple effect of healing and understanding. Veterans organizations reached out to both James and Colonel Montgomery, recognizing the unique opportunity their story presented to highlight the sacrifices made by service members and their families. The following week, the Ministry of Defense issued a special commendation to Private James Montgomery. Rather than reprimanding him for breaking protocol, they praised his handling of an unprecedented situation with both dignity and humanity. His actions, they noted, had demonstrated that beneath the stoic exterior of military discipline beat the heart of human compassion. Colonel William Montgomery was invited to speak at a prestigious military recognition event at St. James's Palace. Standing at the podium, his grandson seated proudly in the front row, he addressed a room full of distinguished veterans and active service members. 20 years ago, he began, I made a choice between duty to country and presence with family. I never imagined that duty would lead me back to my grandson at his own post of service. The colonel's speech touched on themes that resonated with everyone present: the weight of sacrifice, the endurance of family bonds, and the unexpected ways life could come full circle. As he spoke, many in the audience were reminded of their own choices, their own sacrifices, and their own hopes for reunion with loved ones. James's sister Emma, now a mother of 3, organized a family reunion at their old family home in Yorkshire. The house, maintained all these years in hope of their grandfather's return, finally fulfilled its purpose. Colonel Montgomery walked through rooms filled with memories, touching photographs he'd missed being part of, learning about the lives that had continued in his absence. The most poignant moment came when Emma's youngest daughter, 7-year-old Sarah, named after her great-grandmother, presented her great-grandfather with a newly carved wooden eagle pendant. She had insisted on making it after hearing the story of the original pendant her uncle had carved. The colonel wore both eagles side by side, past and present united around his neck. Private Montgomery returned to his duties at Buckingham Palace with renewed purpose. His post, now famous as the site of the reunion, attracted even more visitors than before. Though he maintained the same impeccable discipline, there was a new dimension to his service, a living reminder that behind every uniform stood a human story of love, loss, and dedication. The palace, recognizing the profound impact of their story, established a new tradition. Once a year, on the anniversary of the reunion, they would host a special event honoring military families who had endured long separations. The first ceremony, attended by both Montgomerys, saw hundreds of families sharing their own stories of faith, patience, and homecoming. Colonel Montgomery's classified mission files were finally declassified, revealing the full scope of his sacrifice. The documents confirmed his role in preventing a major security breach that could have compromised not only British intelligence networks but those of allied nations as well. His disappearance had quite literally preserved the safety of countless operatives and their families. As the years passed, the story of the Royal Guard and his grandfather became part of British military lore, taught to new recruits as an example of how duty and humanity could coexist. The spot where they reunited was marked with a small, discreet plaque, its words capturing the essence of their story. On this spot, duty and love proved to be two sides of the same coin. James Montgomery continued his military career with distinction, eventually earning his own command. At his promotion ceremony, it was Colonel William Montgomery who pinned the new insignia on his grandson's uniform, their story coming full circle in front of a new generation of service members. The wooden eagle pendant, now accompanied by its younger companion, became a family symbol, passed down through generations of Montgomerys. It represented not just the bond between a grandfather and grandson, but the enduring strength of family love in the face of duty's demands. Private James Montgomery's last day as a Queen's Guard was marked by special recognition. As he stood at his post one final time, tourists and locals alike gathered to witness the changing of the Guard. Among them stood his grandfather, now well into his 90s but still standing proud, watching his grandson complete his service with the same dedication that had defined their lives. As James Montgomery later wrote in his memoir, "Some might say that breaking protocol that day was a deviation from duty. But I learned that the highest duty we can perform is to recognize our shared humanity, even in moments when tradition demands silence. In finding my grandfather, I also found a deeper understanding of what it means to serve, not just Queen and country, but the timeless bonds that make us who we are." The story of the Royal Guard and his grandfather continues to inspire new generations, a testament to the power of love, duty, and the unexpected moments that can bridge even the widest of life's separations.